And right from the start of this story, things are heating up. A young king in a medieval castle receives all the documentation of the surrender of the Principality of Sherdate, allowing the kingdom's expansion beyond the Halrek iron mine. A dream that has existed in this kingdom since the time the current king's father ruled this land. One of the people responsible for this victory, Margrave, is congratulated by His Majesty. The king had spent some time contemplating what reward he would give to his subordinate if successful. So he asks whether the man's heir has passed the marrying age due to the war. Considering that the royal family must take responsibility for this, the monarch wants to know how old young Eric is. Margrave informs him that his son is turning 24 this year, the number of the pampas deer in the animal lottery, which according to the king, is the perfect age to crush the rat of his dear sister, whom he loves deeply. With that said, Margrave begins to sweat profusely because this woman mentioned is known as the Caviar Princess. Nobody has ever seen or tasted her, just heard about her. In fact, there were rumors that the girl had already kicked the bucket and was announced as playing for Vasco da Gama, but now that the king has offered her up, it seems the rumors were unfounded. Speaking of which, the monarch explains that his officer will be the first man beyond the border to see the princess, because apparently he's kept the poor girl in a dungeon since birth. At least that's the only explanation left for this situation. It's hard to believe otherwise. But now we are introduced to the woman herself, the one everyone talks about, the mysterious and captive princess of the kingdom of Esquilor, Misa Esquilor. Dressed in a prisoner's tunic from Azkaban, the poor girl was looking around like Tarso from Caminho das Indias. Eric catches sight of Misa, and Misa catches sight of Eric. The king calls his sister closer since the poor girl is too shy, perhaps from being kept away from society her whole life, but who knows. However, as she's used to being chained to her bed in captivity, eating Cheetos and watching Hiroshi Manhwa on YouTube, the princess has forgotten how to walk properly, so she ends up tripping and falling to the ground like a tamale. The king remarks that she's not feeling great today, so it's best if everyone pretends they didn't see anything. He then asks her to get up, but by this point, the girl was already looking like the corpse bride on that cold, hard concrete floor. If she blinked, it was already a win. Awkward in the face of such a grotesque scene, Margrave thanks the king for the corpse, just as Eric promises not to use the body of the deceased princess for nefarious purposes. The king requests the young man to approach and get to know his wife better, so Eric walks toward the corpse, his blue cape swaying in the throne room, when suddenly he stops short of trampling his bride. He stands before her in a classic movie moment, where the song Waiting for a Girl Like You by Foreigner plays. He takes the princess's hand and claims it's an honor to meet her. However, the last time the young wildling saw another human being was when she had a stool test 3 years ago, so she freaks out and pulls her hand away, not afraid to be weird. The beast's brother tells her not to treat her husband that way and calls her over for a pat on the head. Like a dog, the so-called princess barks and lifts her paw for more affection, leaving Eric with a "my god, I can't believe my dad gets the enemy's surrender, and I get a dog for a wife" kind of face. After this embarrassing moment, the noble family leaves that madhouse aboard their Ford 1347 carriage. Margrave reflects to himself that he had to sweat hard to give his son that dog, as he had to experience the horrors of a long war where the primary factor in their victory was the Chladni family. Of course, the king was jealous of not being the big boss in the story, so he planned this marriage just to mess with the Chladnis. That night, upon arriving home, all Margrave can do is vent to his pals. After all, he got a Yuga princess raised in captivity in exchange for crushing the king's enemies in a bloody war. On the other hand, Eric understands that despite his thoughts on the princess, there's no way to disobey the king's orders. So he must tuck his tail between his legs, just like Misa, and do everything he's told, even though he is the handsome and charming Lord of Chladni. Eric's cousin Amberic asks if the engagement with the Crispin family went down the drain, and Margrave doesn't even need to answer, as the tyrannical madman just declared it so. The man asks if his wife, Thaliesa, also isn't furious with this arbitrary decision. Ignoring Brazil's time zone, Thaliesa turns with ellipses in her speech bubble and serves herself another round of fine wine. But as the booze spills across the panels, we are transported a few minutes back when a maid tried to convince the lady not to leave the princess in a separate room. Thaliesa replied that there's a passage connecting the rooms, as the nosy girl should know. But the maid insists that the princess isn't well, and her brain will turn to mush, which would surely irritate the king. Thaliesa believes this can be solved by hiring attendants, at which point the women go crazy, because the lady wants to leave the princess in the hands of people who don't even know how to clean their own butts. They claim the king will rip his hair out when he finds out. With a killer look, Thaliasa stared straight at the maids and asked if they were implying that Eric needs to attend to the princess's needs. Buzzed from all this crazy kingly nonsense, Eric's mother now questions her family about how those harpies dared suggest that for the beloved heir of Chladni. Thaliasa had surrendered to debauchery for emotional relief, but Eric remained steady as a wall. Days later, the least anticipated moment for House Chladni arrived. The announcement of the marriage between a brave knight returning victoriously from war and a noble princess was enough to make the people happy after such an intense conflict. However, Eric himself was far from any shred of joy about marrying a Labrador in a dress. Later, at the church hosting the wedding, the guests eagerly awaited the princess's revelation, as so far, all anyone knew was that this doomed girl existed, but no one had ever seen her face. Margrave and Thaliasa just arrived, and the Lord learns that the king won't attend the wedding, driving him even more insane. Honestly, Margrave feels like that crowned serpent is making him a joke, so he resumes walking without any patience for this absurdity. The priest asks everyone to sit so the ceremony can begin, then requests the groom take his place at the pulpit. Wearing his Elvis Presley-style suit, Eric follows the recommendation until the church doors open with the expectation of the princess's arrival. It was indeed her, being carried by her maids as if she might collapse or flee at any moment. Some people wondered if she was okay, while others speculated she was drunk. When Misa finally reached the pulpit, struggling all the way, the priest quickly declared Eric Chladni and Misa of Esquilor as partners before the disaster of her barking randomly in the middle of the ceremony. With that, the priest licked his lips and announced it was time to kiss the bride. Without much thought, Eric planted a kiss on his wife and moved on with his life despite the adversity. At night, back at the Chladni family mansion, Eric received word from the maids that he mustn't hurt the lady on their wedding night in any way, and that tomorrow they will collect proof of the marriage consummation. Whatever that means, I hope it's not a photo of the two of them in bed. Without hesitation, Eric understood the situation and found Misa tied to her bed. He approached her slowly, removing his clothes while repeating the name of his dog. Oops, I mean wife. Suddenly, he notices 2 empty bottles of sedative on the bed, enough to knock out a whale or make Bob Marley seem sober backstage at one of his concerts. These sedatives were enough to leave the girl in a state of helplessness, a punishment even prisoners of war don't receive. Eric wonders how any son of a B*** could do this to this girl so easily, and concludes that no one would have the courage to do so unless it were by order of the king himself, given that she is his sister. With that deduction, the Lord freaks out, unties the girl, and covers her up, as her body temperature had dropped significantly. In a moment of stupidity, he asks if the girl is okay, then remembers she drank 2 gallons of morphine, and her brain is probably floating somewhere between Jupiter and Saturn. Just as he untied her feet, the gentleman unties the girl's hands and notices the redness left on her fingertips from being bound for so long. After freeing her, he concluded that there was only one way to prevent the poor girl from freezing to death. So he asked Misa to move aside as he climbed under the covers naked. Being all sweet and caring, Eric explained that he was from the Chladni family, 24 years old, and had no siblings. He did have a younger sister, but she was lost in an accident when they were kids. Eric explained that he had spent his whole life at the border because of the war against the Principality of Sherde, but now he would spend the rest of it alongside Misa. At least, that's what the king asked of him. After concluding his presentation, Eric wondered if the girl could even hear anything, but the truth was that her brain was more fried than the steak I forgot on the stove last night. Either way, he thought it best to tell her what the heck was going on. He explained that winter on the frontier was brutal, and freezing starts at the body's extremities until you turn into a human popsicle, so it was essential to keep the blood flowing from the tips of her little body. While giving this lecture on uncomfortable temperatures, Eric saw the girl's skin gradually returning to normal, so he figured she'd be okay if she rested a bit longer. But the issue was that he needed to create evidence of the wedding night, and Eric considered sending a photo of him on top of Misa to the kingdom's WhatsApp group. But since social media didn't exist back then, he had to improvise after seeing 2 empty glasses in the room. The next day, he presented the evidence to the cleaning ladies, a cloth supposedly with the blood of a broken hymen, though I'd bet it was wine. The maids took the cloth to deliver it to the priest, and then went to dress the princess, but the Lord stopped them, saying the girl was still knocked out and needed more rest. So the maids accepted this without further question and left without fuss. When Eric returned to the room, he heard the sound of some animal gnawing on something, but we all know it wasn't any beast, right? Yes, it was Misa Esquiller in her animal mode, chewing on the blanket without a care in the world. He tried to teach the princess that she shouldn't eat the blanket, but apparently she didn't understand or was just a stubborn wild animal. Who knows? Either way, Eric assumed his wife was hungry, so he grabbed one of those overly heavy bakery croissants with cheap sausage filling and handed it to the famished girl. With nothing to lose, Misa snatched the food from the Lord's hand and stuffed it into her mouth without mercy. He then looked at her with genuine joy, grateful she had the courage to eat the snack he bought at the Taguatinga bus station 6 months ago, because his mom taught him it's wrong to waste food. By late afternoon, he finally returned to the family mansion with his pet wife, but his parents didn't seem thrilled to see their son still accompanied by this individual with more canine traits than human ones. Perhaps for this reason, or so I assume, Margrave wondered how things had sunk to this level. He decided to cry in the shower when the princess decided it was a good idea to try to mate with a bear statue in the garden. After watching his son pull the crazy woman off the statue, the man could only lament the situation with a deep hatred that mere words could never express the true intensity of this overwhelming feeling. Eric, for his part, was speechless at his wife's antics, but since he's a fully formed Buddha and not easily rattled, he remained strong as a bull while his wife, who was definitely a dog, couldn't take her eyes off the bear statue. A maid offered to take care of the mess, but Eric let the blessed women rest from the trip. With giggles aimed at the man, they left the scene after being dismissed. Afterward, Eric informed the butler that Misa is a member of the family, so she should be treated as such when she's not feeling well. Of course, the butler isn't crazy enough to argue with his boss, but Eric's mother, who watched the scene with her villainous face, is likely not 100% on board with her son's statement. Later, during a family meal, Eric asked the maids to leave, as he could feed his wife without help. The maids warned him that the girl goes nuts during meals, so it's always important to have backup. Ignoring that, he asked if she liked anything specific, but they explained that she's worse than a pig and ostrich, eating anything you put in front of her. So Eric cut a piece of meat and gave it to his wife, who chewed slowly for some reason. Knowing the girl was a troglodyte, Eric already braced himself, but couldn't avoid Misa spitting the food right in his face. To make matters worse, she slammed her plate on the table with force, completely losing her cool. While the maids continued giggling behind the Lord's back, he wondered if maybe she didn't like goblin penis meat, the Chladni kitchen specialty. Without getting a satisfactory answer, he asked the maids to prepare to clean the princess, an order they obeyed as promptly as when your dad told you to turn off the TV and go to bed as a kid because church was early the next day. With less patience for the wildling than her son, Eric's parents began plotting something nasty behind the scenes. Their idea was that Misa didn't need to live much longer in this house. Margrave made a hand signal that indicated it would be game over for the princess, but Thaliasa responded with gestures, saying they'd be booted from the server if they dumped the girl in a ditch. Eavesdropping on that muted conversation, Eric realized there was some shady business going on. In the next scene, we are taught about the geopolitics of Esquiller. In this kingdom, there are 3 houses known as the 3 Pillars. The first is House Salazake, with a coat of arms featuring a snake wrapped around a tree. This clan was responsible for laying the foundations of the kingdom. With a badass coat of arms depicting a pampas deer, House Crispin is responsible for the kingdom's internal security. Lastly, boasting a coat of arms with a black bear framed by 2 crossed swords, we have House Chladni, in charge of external security. Obviously, these 3 clans had significant influence over the kingdom's military and security. Now, speaking of the land of Esquiller's former sovereign, the late king, known as King of the Ladies or medieval Mr. Catra. He had 3 queens, each from a different family. The first prince was born from the daughter of the Duke of Salazek. Being the eldest, the most conniving character in this work, so far snagged the crown and became the Joffrey Baratheon of the new generation. The cursed king Mayor Malik II, the tyrant. Being an irresponsible kid, he basically did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, neglecting his duties as the sovereign of this no man's land. Under the guise of maintaining order, Mayor Malik wiped out his mother's entire family, House Salazek. As if that weren't enough, the tyrant began persecuting the other 2 most important families in the kingdom, so they decided to unite to withstand the brat's tantrums. Secretly, Houses Chladni and Crispin arranged the marriage of their heirs to maintain their power and spark a rebellion after the war ended. However, as expected, things went south. House Chladni, after gaining great prestige during the kingdom's conflicts, won the people's sympathy, who were fed up with Joffrey Baratheon from Wish's tyranny. The king, for his part, couldn't let that Baratheon, sorry for the pun, since if anyone deserved applause in this mess, it had to be him. This is where we understand why he threw this bomb at House Chladni, and that bomb is called Misa. As Margrave repeats for the 59th time, the cursed girl is so out of her mind, she doesn't even know how to hold a fork. Thalassa argues that the princess was normal as a child, but lost her mind after seeing people murdered before her eyes. Eric comments that this is unfortunate, to which his father shouts, "Who's feeling sorry for whom?" To make matters worse, the man points out that some vassals are suggesting Ambric replace Eric as heir, and even the Marquis Crispin floated this idea to correct the mess the king threw at the Chladnis. In other words, Eric's position as heir is threatened because of Misa Esquiller. As usual, our boy Eric's speech bubble fills with ellipses, proving once again that his unwavering stance is just a facade. He asks if Grand Duke Hagel is still hesitating, and his father replies that the guy is a huge coward. Recalling a fateful event, Margrave wonders if they accidentally took Hagel's upper head along with his lower one. Speaking of the devil, Grand Duke Hagel is the king's cousin and the only living member of the royal family besides the princess. Although she's a crucial figure for legitimizing the rebellion, he suffered an accident, in quotes, leaving him paralyzed and unable to produce heirs. My God, I don't even want to know what happened to this guy's balls because just imagining the pain makes me want to wail in pity for the poor man. To make matters worse, aside from lacking balls, Hagel also has no friends, condemning him to a sad and isolated life. In other words, the concept of luck in this man's life is as non-existent as his testicles. Frustrated, Margrave slams his hand on the table, shouting that nothing goes right in this dump, then runs off to cry in bed where it's warm. His wife complains that her husband has been losing his temper too much these days, while Eric stares at her with increasingly ellipsed speech bubbles. Pretty soon, someone will start writing Braille in those things, and I'm paying to see it. Changing the subject, Thalassa fills another glass of Cantina de Serra wine and asks what her son thinks about uniting the two houses through marriage. He replies that it seemed like a crazy idea at first, but now that he's in the thick of it, it still feels like the beginning. After all, marriage is something that grabs the entire kingdom's attention. It's not something you can simply hide from the king. Still, since there's no heir to the throne, convincing the nobles could take forever, and the Marquis's daughter can't remain single for too long. To that, Thalassa agrees and adds that the war has rotted people's political instincts just like Monarch's brain, given that even a donkey like her son understands what's going on. But that bumbling idiot of her husband still goes on about canceling the princess's CPF. Lastly, since she brought up Misa, the noblewoman acknowledges that it's not advantageous to open themselves up to criticism from the maids. But in one thing, the Falchians were right. Eric shouldn't even think about loving that wild princess. While the young man looks at his mother with a dumbfounded face, she claims that a man's love is superficial, just like her dad's was with her before he left to buy cigarettes and never came back. Thalassa doesn't expect her son to be any different, so she's already informed Mr. Big Oat at the corner store that young Eric will be buying a pack of Marlboro Red when things get tough. As night falls, Eric walks through the mansion's hallways, always accompanied by his ellipsed speech bubble. Depressed, he begins to believe his mother wants to pull his wife's plug, just like his father. As he recalls that beautiful face, those lovely feet, that perfect little hand, and that Fusca engine-like snoring, the young lord gets ticked off at the thought of his beloved being taken away from him. In the midst of his reflections, he's surprised by voices coming from the young lady's room, where those cursed maids were mistreating his beloved, trying to force her to go to bed. Inside, the maids complained that the girl was heavier than a hippo after eating the entire lasagna at dinner. So much so that people were looking at the girl with disgust and contempt for her repugnant behavior. This wild beast that dares to be called a princess. In the next scene, Eric appears in the room, lamenting how hard the maids had worked today. Unfortunately, the ellipsed man heard little of what was said inside, so he didn't know that the witches were screwing with the poor girl. Thus, he asked both of them to leave, which they promptly did, leaving Eric alone with Misa once again. After observing the princess intently, along with his favorite ellipsed speech bubble, he concluded that Misa was in a great mood today, so he decided to sit next to her and ease her into her new life in society. Today's story was that Misa was now at the capital mansion and would henceforth live her life lounging between this place and the region of Cladis. Speaking of lounging, Eric wanted to know if the girl was going through a rough patch at the hands of some scoundrel in this mansion, as she seemed to want to make eye contact when he entered the room, though she quickly lost interest. Either way, he thought it absurd that the princess only wore that ragged dress that looked like something out of The Ring, especially with that Barbie-like face she flaunted around. It just wasn't fair. The girl should be treated like the doll she was, according to the Lord. Speaking of dolls, Eric felt the heat of passion rushing through his veins as he ran his eyes over his wife's beautifully sculpted face, especially when she pressed her lips together and spat a nice gob of saliva in the man's face. Even so, this wasn't the time to indulge in bizarre fetishes, but rather to teach his wife how to behave in public. So he explained that it wasn't cool to spit on people without their permission. With that said, he asked Misa to sleep because, after what had happened, he needed to quickly resolve a tense 5-against-1 situation that would soon unfold in the bathroom at full throttle. So he got up and asked his wife not to call him if anything happened, leaving his speech bubble with Misa, so he wouldn't have to witness the atrocity that would happen to the shower drain. Half an hour later, our hero returned to the bedroom and rested beside his wife in bed. The strong wind blowing against the window gave the impression that something nasty would happen at any moment, and this feeling was reinforced when a lightning bolt struck near the bedroom balcony. Now that we've panned the camera down to the bottom of the panel, you might have been spooked by the fact that Misa had her eyes eerily wide open next to Eric, which I must confess happened to me while writing this script at 11 p.m. in my dark bedroom. When morning came, our protagonist was still alive, as we can see. So, let's move on with the plot. Trying to spoon-feed his beloved some soup, he asked if she had slept well, as switching from a king-size premium plus bed to a king-size presidential V might have given her a backache. Shoving a dry bread roll down her throat without a second thought, Misa still hadn't uttered a single word, only emitting animalistic grunts. At that moment, Rick activated his ellipsed speech bubble to indicate that the clown's brain was working, and he concluded that the girl's appearance had worsened. She looked more roughed up than she did before. Moving on from that, he advised Misa that it was good to eat to stay strong, even if she wasn't hungry. However, the girl plunged her hand into the soup without mercy, making a big splash for the poor guy who would have to clean up the mess. As if that wasn't enough, she pulled her hand out of the food and shoved it into her mouth. Truly a deplorable scene. The man watched the tragedy unfold, accompanied by 5 ellipses. Without a doubt, the arrival of the princess had turned House Chladni's life upside down. After her marriage to Eric, the atmosphere in the territory had changed, though not very visibly. While his men trained intensely, Captain Eric Chladni arrived at the training ground, flaunting his tight black shirt to make a statement. The men welcomed the officer and tried to keep the vibe the same, but in reality, the awkward tension was palpable in the air, and it was clear that everyone had something to say about the boss's wife. Eric barked at the group, ordering them to get back to training, and the soldiers clammed up, returning to their work. But the training ground wasn't the only place things were getting ugly. Margrave Chladni himself had started avoiding family meals because of Misa, as he could no longer stand her antics at the dinner table. This caused Thaliesa to start complaining about her husband's behavior, as the man was losing his cool at every meal. This affected the mood of all the vassals of House Chladni, who became confused by this unusual phase of their overlords. Nevertheless, of course, no one dared speak up in front of Eric for fear of being sliced across the mouth for free. Despite the awful atmosphere taking hold, Eric always maintained his firm and calm demeanor, causing people to question whether the captain was a strong man or just a fool who had no idea what was going on. After returning from his intense training session without moving a muscle, Eric wiped his sweat with a towel and asked the butler where his wife was. The butler reported that she'd been wandering around the house, but now she was in the maid's workroom. Outraged, the Lord demanded to know what those women wanted with his wife. In the maid's room, they watched Misa sleep as if she were a work of art or an animal in a cage, depending on the point of view. One of them commented that the girl preferred to sleep in that corner because of the smell of farts and dirty laundry, which made her fall into a deep sleep as the aroma weakened her vital signs. Another maid was simpler and bet that the princess liked the softness of the piled-up clothes. A third maid suggested it could be a problem for them to let her sleep wrapped in the servants' clothes, as the scent of common folk might anger Margrave. Lastly, another maid remarked that the lady's hair was beautiful and shiny, like strands of silver, and a colleague remembered once seeing a white kitten just like that. At that moment, Eric entered, asking about the 2 royal maids, that troublesome duo, as the 2 women responsible for Misa were nowhere to be found. The other maids admitted they didn't know where they had gone, but Thaliesa had been informed that the princess was there, and since Misa had chosen to sleep on the cold, hard floor of the workroom, they had placed their clothes to warm and soften it like a bed. With that, Eric instructed them to return to their tasks and picked up his wife. After climbing the stairs with the wild girl and walking through the mansion's halls, the Lord Captain arrived at their enormous bedroom, only to be surprised when Misa suddenly opened her eyes in shock. She let out a few grunts and struggled in the man's arms. So Eric hurried to lay her on the bed before the luggage fell and fractured a rib for no reason. With that done, she stood on all fours on the bed in a canine attack position, which the young officer responded to by processing in his limited mind what this animalistic behavior could mean. To be honest with himself, after observing the woman for these past few days, he had concluded that Misa didn't particularly like him. For some reason, Eric felt that Misa saw him only as a means of transportation, perhaps a pack mule or a free bus. Noticing a stray hair on the girl's head, the young man tried to remove it, but his brilliant mind couldn't foresee that the frightened beast would behave like a frightened beast, desperately fleeing from his hands. He tried to calm Misa and explained that he had no intention of hurting her, only wanting to yank the hair from her scalp. Then, taking advantage of the fact that his deep, soothing voice had relaxed the wildling, he removed the strand and wondered if the poor girl had really freaked out over something so trivial. Suddenly, Misa Esquiler looked directly at the man, who reacted as we know by now. If you have no idea how he reacted at this point in the story, here's a hint. He didn't say a single word. Anyway, inside the girl's deranged mind, she remembered the maid's words about a beautiful white kitten she had once seen. That's when Misa realized she might have found her own white kitten. With the nightfall over House Cladney, Misa let out terrible, deafening roars while sleeping soundly, as her husband sat in the office with a document in hand. The paper read, Malika Adil. These were the names of the princess's 2 personal maids. According to the record, the 2 troublemakers always abandoned Misa, leaving her in the hands of the other staff, and always making themselves scarce at the first opportunity. Apparently, the diabolical duo had some sort of scheme up their sleeves. But that wasn't the only problem. For example, aside from that, there was also the fact that the food supply for the territory's residents was a complete disaster. Everything happening at House Cladney was drama, and more drama. Nothing else. But it didn't stop there. Another issue had been keeping the Lord awake on this starry night. Upon opening a letter in an envelope, Eric read a news report addressed to the young master. According to the young master's instructions, someone had been tasked with tracking the targets, and it was discovered they had another meeting at that house on the outskirts last night. Yes, that girl from the tavern was having a fling with the young master, none other than Lord Margrave Cladney.